This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
Conference Preview Week continues on the high school football roundup, and it's time to talk about 8-player football. 2 local teams set to compete in the Ridge and Valley 8-player conference. The Belmont Braves, who have had some success in 8-player football over the last couple of years, and a newcomer, Highland, coming over from 11-player to this 8-player conference. And we are joined by Highland/Belmont truther Steve Prestegard, as well as Matthew Goninen, to talk about this Ridge and Valley 8-player conference. Just to kind of recap where the teams finished last year, North Crawford had an outstanding football season, went undefeated during the regular season before being bounced in the first round of the postseason. Belmont just missing the 8-player playoffs last year with a 5-3 overall record. Other teams competing in the conference, Wisconsin Heights, DeSoto, who had previously been very good in both 11-player and 8-player, missed out on the playoffs last year. Wanawak Weston, Kickapoo, Lafarge, and now Monticello, who again split from the co-op with New Glarus to be a standalone 8-player football program. And Steve, let's start off with Highland making that switch from 11-player to 8-player. Obviously, there's variables that come into play with that. The big thing is just overall enrollment at Highland. Highland has had the reputation in years past that they were one of, if not the smallest school to field an 11-player team. So it's no real surprise that they switched to 8-player just because of the numbers and things like that. Maybe a bit surprising that they chose not to co-op with another school locally, but it's very cool to see that Highland continues to maintain that tradition. They get to keep playing all their home games at Tyler Field, and we talk about it during our shows and during our broadcasts at Highland. Highland is one of the best places in the area to call games regardless of sport. What do you make of this transition from 11-player to 8-player?
Well, you notice during the meeting that we had to assign games, I jumped on the Highland Saturday game in order to get one of those steak sandwiches they make that's really good. The thing with Highland switching from 11-player to 8-player was never about lack of competition or their inability to be competitive, because they were always a top echelon team in the Six Rivers, and then the last couple of years, Ridge and Valley. They ended up being the last champion of the 11-player Ridge and Valley. I think in a general sense, and who knows what about this year, but I think in a general chance, Highland's got a terrific opportunity here to do really well in 8-player, because one thing that Highland always has is great athletes. And when you have your quarterback back, and when you have 3 receivers back in a kind of style of football that really places a premium on having athletes, I think those are really great points for the Cardinals. It's never been a question of, are they able to compete? It's been a question of the numbers, and they've had, if you look at the size of their rosters, they've had, it feels like practically every male student at Highland was playing football. They had talked about co-oping with a few other schools, but one of the reasons they didn't want to do that is because they put a fair amount of money into upgrading Tyler Field not so many years ago, and they didn't want to do that and have just 2 home games, which is what ends up happening with kind of the more modern co-op arrangements like Blackhawk Warren or Benton Scales Mount Shullsburg. A place like Potosi Cassville, where they have 1 home game at Cassville, is kind of increasingly rare now. The co-ops more often than not share the number of home games that they have. And for the amount of money that they put into upgrading Tyler Field, they didn't want to just have a couple of home games a year. So that, and the distance, because let's face it, Highland to Iowa Grant or Riverdale or Boscobel or Fenimore, those are not necessarily real short trips on great roads. So the distance and those sorts of factors really was the ultimate thing that made Highland decide to go to 8-player.
Yep, and the great thing for Highland is, when you look at the players that they have coming back from last year's team, you would expect that they're going to be instant contenders. Wish Sports has them projected to finish in second place behind North Crawford in their preseason rankings. And Matthew, we were talking before we started recording, the weapons that Highland has coming back, they've got some pretty solid firepower.
Yeah, I mean, we look at some of the stats from last year, and as Steve mentioned, that wide receiver core really strong, bringing back John Dreschmeyer, also bringing back Wes Krasinger and Michael Esser, all three topping the stat list in receiving yards last year. And at quarterback, Bennett Smith, who was the first team all-conference selection in the 8-man Ridge and Valley last year, really strong at quarterback. Also, a lot of all-conference players on defense are bringing back 11 all-conference selections from last year. And the thing that's going to be interesting to see for them is how their playing style is able to translate over to that 8-man, because in some sort of way, it is a little bit different of a game than 11-man, which they're so used to playing. And in a team that likes to pass the ball a lot, they threw for over 1,800 yards last year, 18 touchdowns rather, through the air, and they had a really strong defense as well. They forced 12 fumbles and got 11 interceptions along the way. So it's going to be interesting to see what that transition looks like, but it's going to be really fun to watch Highland compete at the top of the Ridge and Valley in 8-man.
It should be a very fun year for the Highland Cardinals. We'll keep tabs on them throughout the season. And now let's talk about Belmont, who has been, for quite a few years, our only local 8-player football team competing in that sport. And Belmont the last few years had been very, very successful. They've had reached the 8-player playoffs pretty much every year for the most part. In 2020, they were undefeated, but there was no state championship game or anything due to COVID. They reached the state championship game 2 years ago, but fell to a juggernaut Wausau Newman team, which Belmont ran into Wausau Newman multiple times, pretty much since 2020. And Steve, I love the job that Brandon Weiss has done with Belmont. It's a very fun program to watch. Just missing out on the playoffs last year, and looking to try and be a contender for the postseason at the top of this conference as well.
Yeah, that's right. Belmont's a really interesting case, and I have to believe that Belmont's pretty much immediate success at 8-player kind of prompted some other schools to make the switch that might not otherwise have been. Highland could be an example of that. But right off the bat, in the case of Belmont, they became successful at 8-player. That was not really the case when they were playing 11-player the last few years. They had big numbers problems, and then they would end up, missing the playoffs. I'm not quite sure the last year that Belmont made the 11-player playoffs, but all of a sudden, once they got into 8-player, things started going great for them. I think that one of the things that's interesting about Belmont that it's going to be interesting to watch with Highland is, again, making, as Matthew pointed out, making that conversion from the 11-player game to the 8-player game when, among other things, you lose, I'm trying to remember my numbers if these are right, but you end up losing a skilled position player and 2 linemen. So typically, as I believe it is the case, 8-player teams generally have just 3 linemen. If you end up going from 11-player to 8-player, you had a lot of linemen graduate. Well, that ends up working out pretty well for you because you don't have to replace that many number of guys. 8-player is kind of interesting because not as many teams proportionally make the playoffs. And if they had, I have to think that given the growth in 8-player, at some point they're going to have to expand the playoffs. If they were to add another round, I think that Belmont would have made the playoffs, and DeSoto probably would have also. So, all of those factors, and of course, in 2020, I guess technically they did win the state championship in a sense, because you might remember that 2020, because of COVID, they had pod play, right, where you could play up to 2 playoff games. Belmont actually decided to play, I believe it was Gilman, kind of independently, and that was considered the unofficial state championship. and Belmont won. So I've not been in the Belmont gym to check the walls yet, but I think over at the Platte Journal, we consider them to have been the state champions in 2020. Regardless of that, Belmont's just been tremendously successful. And the other great thing about A players, you don't have to replace that many guys due to graduation. Although, to be honest about it, a guy like Riley Christensen, who is just, well, I don't know. I don't know of very many 250-pound fast quarterbacks out there.
Right.
He was the guy that basically propelled that team to winning state in 2020, because how do you stop a 250-pound quarterback who can run and throw the ball? Obviously, he's long gone into college football, but having their quarterback Gavin Opitz back, obviously that has to help. Replacing guys is going to be a big thing, but you like it. I don't know that I've ever seen an 8-player team at this point that doesn't have a dual threat quarterback, and so having a guy that can do that, I think, is an immediate benefit for the Braves.
Yeah, but Matthew, as Steve alluded to, Gavin Opitz, one of the key players returning for Belmont. What's the analysis that you can provide on him and some of the other returning players for Belmont?
Yeah, and so Steve talked about the positive impact that the dual threat quarterbacks have had at Belmont and other 8-man programs. And we saw that last year with Gavin Opitz. He had more rushing touchdowns than he had passing touchdowns. And we really haven't seen a lot of a passing game at Belmont. They focused on their run game last year, and they had a lot of success with it. They had 18 touchdowns on the ground last year. So it's going to be interesting to see how they can continue with that. On defense, not as many takeaways as a team like Highland had. So interesting to see what they're going to look like on defense this year. They do bring back 4 all-conference selections from last year's Ridge and Valley 8-man West League on defense, but going to be really interesting to see what Belmont is this year and if they stick to that ground game that they were successful with last year.
I think that probably one thing that benefits Belmont also is having Gavin Opitz back, because you can talk about, well, they ran the ball a lot, A, because they wanted to, and B, that was perhaps his strength. But any quarterback in his second year, you figure, is going to improve a lot. That he'll have had an entire year of not just playing games, but practicing and knowing how things work and all of that. So I think any coach, if you ever ask them, would prefer to have a second-year quarterback instead of a first-year quarterback that you're trying to teach, how to play. There are always exceptions, TJ Pinkham-Platteville being the obvious one that comes to mind, but I think any coach would really prefer to have a quarterback that's got that year's experience back, and he does have that. So that's a big plus, I think, also for the Braves.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind, too, with 8-player, we talk about Belmont just missing the playoffs. Keep in mind, there's only one division for 8-player football. There's only 16 playoff spots that are available, and it's really hard to, get into the postseason if you slip up. And, Belmont's record was 5-3 last year, but you would expect that, now with Highland, being in the mix, North Crawford, the defending conference champion, brings back a lot of firepower there. I think it's still going to be tough, but I think having Highland in that conference helps Belmont's chances a little bit more because of the quality of competition that they're facing. And, if there's a tiebreaker or something like that to help get them in, I think that's going to help out. And, I'm not sure how far away we are from having multiple divisions for 8-player football. I know it's something that had, come up, whether it's with the Wisconsin Football Coaches Association or the WIAA. Again, there's only 16 spots, and, there's multiple, 8-player teams across the state besides the ones that we have here in Southwest Wisconsin. So we hope if not both of our local teams are going to be poised to get in for the postseason. One other thing,
Tyler, to keep in mind as far as 8-player, you have to remember that there's actually a fair number of schools that can't play in the playoffs because they're too big. The 8-player playoff limit is 200 students, and there's one school I can't remember what it's called now, St. Mary's Valley Christian up in the Fox River Valley, that always does well, but their season always comes to an end at the end of the regular season because they're too big. And that would be an interesting thought also to see, would the WI just add a round of postseason? Or B, would they go to like a 2-division setup where the schools that are presently ineligible to play because they're too big might have a chance to be in the postseason? But that is a question for another day, obviously.
Right. Yeah, and one of the teams that I have my eye on outside of the two that we have locally that should be a contender. I think DeSoto is a very interesting team in that Ridge and Valley 8-player conference. That's been a team that Belmont has run into quite a bit and have played very competitive games. And when you kind of think of 8-player football, you kind of think the field is spread out quite a bit more, kind of a higher scoring type. I think I compared it last year to like arena football, but it's outdoors. Similar concept. But when Belmont and DeSoto played each other a couple seasons ago in the postseason, the final score was 14-12. So I mean, both programs were very defensively sound. Ev Wick is a very good coach at DeSoto. They have 5 returning starters on each side of the ball, and they've got multiple players coming back. And based on what he said to Travis Wilson at Wisports, that he's got guys that are in the weight room and have been very committed. So even though the projections look like that they're going to finish in the bottom half or in the number 5 spot, I think that that's a team to have an eye on. Any other insights for the Ridge Valley 8-player conference? Steve, I'll start with you.
Well, I think one of the things that's great about 8-player football is that it's quite unpredictable, even more so than 11-player is. I don't remember what we said a year ago, but did anybody really think North Crawford was going to go through the regular season undefeated? I don't think so.
We also didn't think North Crawford was going to be that good in boys basketball last year too.
Well,
and they were, a fringe top 10 team all year.
Right. Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind is that DeSoto, I think, given the fact that they had a playoff streak in 11-player that started in 1996, that they were going to go into 8-player and just dominate. And they did well in their first season, but last year, even though it was a pretty good season, they did miss the playoffs. So there's nothing necessarily guaranteed about this, obviously. And in a kind of negative sense, there's nothing guaranteed also. You can look at Wynowac Center Weston, which had a real tough time. It was, pretty unsuccessful 11-player co-op program. I think people thought that going 8-player was going to was going to help their situation. And they've been slightly more successful, but that's really all that you can say about it. It's, 8-player for whatever reason is pretty unpredictable for what you think is going to happen versus what has happened, at least in this area in the last few seasons. That's one of the things that's really fun about it.
Yep, exactly. And Matthew, your thoughts on the conference as a whole?
It's going to be really interesting to see a bunch of teams in this conference, and how the conferences have changed over the last couple of years, with Ridge and Valley not having that 11-player side to it anymore, and getting rid of the West and East and bringing all these new teams together and changing up the schedule. So it's going to be interesting to see what that's going to look like. We've got obviously Highland moving down from 11-man. We've got, in a sense, the birth of a new program this year with Monticello breaking away from Nuclearis Monticello and seeing what that's going to look like. So just a lot of questions across the board. It'll be fun to watch it all play out.
Yep, should be a very fun conference to keep tabs on. Again, our two local teams, Highland and Belmont, expected to be, favorites at the top of the conference, and we'll keep tabs on them throughout the season. We do have their regular season matchup set to be on one of our Queen Bee radio stations. I believe it's September 13th thereabouts, but I don't have the calendar in front of me. But yeah, we will have that game on Queen Bee Radio when those two play each other in Highland, which I believe that'd be the first time that the football programs have met since 2017, I would believe, because I believe it was 2018 where Belmont made the transition to 8-player. So it'd be 7 years-ish since they've last went head-to-head in football. We know about their rivalries in baseball and of course the girls sports over the last couple of years between Highland and Belmont. Always contentious and high stakes programs there. So yeah, that wraps up our 8-player football preview covering Highland and Belmont, and our conference preview week wraps up tomorrow with our one-on-one with the Great One interview with Travis Winkers, the head coach of the Darlington Redbirds. Very fun conversation, covers his coaching journey and his expectations for the Darlington football team. And then coming up a week from tomorrow, our first high school football games of the season on Queen Bee Radio. 4 games on opening night. We have a doubleheader on Extreme 107.1. We get things kicked off, a fun one right out of the gate. Darlington taking on Platteville. 2 o'clock kickoff on Extreme 107.1. And then the nightcap on the X, we will have Iowa Grant and Fenimore. A fun rivalry game to begin the season there. On 97.7 Country WGLR, Matthew and I will have the call of Lancaster and Mineral Point. And then on Super Hits 106, really intriguing non-conference matchup, Potosi-Cassville hosting Cuba City in Potosi. Very fun game expected to be that night. And those are the 4 games that we have on Queen Bee Radio coming up a week from tomorrow on week 1. And just like that, the regular season will be underway in high school football a week from tomorrow. For Stephen Matthew and Tyler Diktanas, thanks for joining us on the High School Football Roundup.